Have you ever stood in front of a mirror and the person staring back feels like a stranger? You've tried the plans, you've counted the calories, you've powered through the workouts that felt like punishment. Maybe you saw a number on the scale drop for a while. But then, life crept back in. The old habits returned, disguised as comfort. The weight followed, often bringing friends. And you're left with that quiet, persistent question. Why can't I make this stick? Welcome to Health Storytellers. This is a place for narratives, not just instructions, for understanding the why behind the what. Today's story isn't about a miracle diet or a brutal exercise regime. It's about a journey that began not in a gym, but in the mind. It's my story of losing 50 pounds. But the real victory, the permanent one, wasn't in the losing. It was in a profound psychological shift, a change in the very story I told myself about who I was and what my body was for. This is that story. If you're ready to look at change from a different angle, settle in. Let's begin. The memory is not one of a dramatic rock bottom. There was no moment of shattering a scale or staring, horrified, at a photograph. My moment of reckoning was quieter, more insidious, and far more profound. It arrived on an utterly ordinary Tuesday morning, in the simple, ancient act of tying my shoes. I was seated on the edge of the bed, leaning forward. The simple cotton laces of my running shoes, shoes I had purchased with a familiar, fervent hope during a previous health kick, dangled before me. As I reached down, a slight compression in my abdomen triggered a familiar, shallow catch in my breath. It was a small sensation, one I had grown accustomed to ignoring. But that morning, for reasons I still cannot fully articulate, I chose not to ignore it. In that pause, in that half-breath, a clarity colder than any winter air washed over me. This was not merely a physical sensation of tightness. It was the tangible manifestation of a deeper constriction, a life that felt increasingly limited, a spirit that felt housed in a vessel that was slowly, steadily becoming a prison. The stranger in the mirror wasn't just a face softened by time and indulgence. It was the face of someone who had begun to accept discomfort as a default state. This quiet despair was the culmination of a decade spent trapped in a cycle I had come to know intimately, the cycle of the temporary finish line. My history with weight loss was not a history of failure, per se. It was a history of short-lived, fiercely won campaigns. I was a veteran of these brief, brutal wars on my own body. There was the era of the meticulous counter, where my world reduced to numbers in an app. I could recite the caloric cost of an apple or a slice of bread with detached precision. My days were a successful equation, my worth measured in a green deficit at the end of the day. Then came the reign of the elimination diet, where entire food groups were exiled with moral certainty. Carbs became a dirty word, sugar a sworn enemy. I experienced the potent, dizzying victory of rapid loss, mistaking the intense physiological reaction for pure willpower. And who could forget the 30-day extreme fitness challenges? The ones filled with burpees and mountain climbers, performed with a grimace of determination, a punishment for the sin of existing in a body I had come to resent. I would stream these workouts, following along with unnervingly cheerful instructors, their relentless positivity feeling like a reproach. I pushed through, not for joy, but for the promise of an after. Each of these endeavors was framed in my mind as a project. They had a clear external architecture, a start date, a set of rules, a goal weight, and an implicit end date. They were periods of white-knuckled willpower, characterized by a pervasive sense of deprivation and a constant internal negotiation. Just get through this week, I'd think. Just make it to the vacation, then you can relax. My motivation was entirely extrinsic, rooted in the desire to reach a destination. A number on a scale, a dress size for a single event, the fleeting approval of others. I was living for the after. The present moment was merely an obstacle course to be endured. And endure it, I sometimes did. I would reach those temporary finish lines. I remember the electric thrill of fitting into a pair of jeans that had languished in the back of my closet. The congratulatory comments from colleagues, "You look great," would send a surge of validation through me. I had completed the project. I had won. But herein lay the fatal flaw in my entire philosophy, the belief that the finish line was a place where I could stop running. Unconsciously, my brain had received the reward and processed the completion. The project was over. The rigorous discipline, perceived as a temporary state of emergency, could now be retired. A single celebratory meal would slide into a week of moderation, which was, in truth, a carefully unmonitored slide. The workouts, never anchored in anything but a desire to reduce, began to feel optional. I've earned a break, I'd tell myself. The return was never a dramatic collapse. It was a slow, almost imperceptible reabsorption into old patterns. It was the extra serving that became routine again. It was the elevator chosen over the stairs, not out of laziness, but out of a renewed belief that my body wasn't built for exertion. It was the late-night snacks that returned as companions for stress or boredom. With each choice, a low hum of guilt would sound, but it was muffled by a louder, more convincing narrative. You know how to do this. You'll start again on Monday, or after the holidays, or next month. The weight would return, of course. Often, it brought reinforcements, an extra 5 pounds, a deeper sense of resignation, a more entrenched belief that this was simply my genetic destiny, my unchangeable story. The cycle would then begin anew, each iteration starting from a place of slightly greater desperation and slightly diminished self-trust. I had become trapped in a loop of repetitive, exhausting sprints, each one leaving me more tired than the last, while the marathon of my life continued on without a coherent strategy. The core problem I eventually understood was not in my diet or my exercise plan. The core problem was psychological, a fundamental flaw in my narrative. I had been approaching change as a temporary battle against my own body. I saw my body as the opponent, a recalcitrant thing to be subdued through rules and force. My self-worth became a variable directly tied to the numerical output of my scale. A good number meant I was a good, disciplined person. A bad number meant I was weak, lacking in moral fiber. This framework made sustained success impossible. It created a state of constant psychological civil war. Willpower, as researchers have consistently shown, is a finite resource, like a muscle that fatigues. Relying on it exclusively to resist a lifetime of ingrained habits and environmental cues is a losing proposition. Furthermore, by framing the journey as a temporary project, I had failed to change the underlying identity that drove my habits. I was still, at my core, a person who viewed healthy choices as a painful deviation from my natural state, a state of indulgence and inertia. The finish line was always a destination, a point on a map I would visit before inevitably returning home to my old self. I had been trying to build a magnificent, fragile structure on a foundation of sand. Every emotional storm, a stressful week at work, a personal disappointment, the simple fatigue of daily life would wash it all away. Leaning back on that bed, the shoe finally tied. I looked at my hands. I had been trying to solve for the wrong variable. The equation wasn't about finding the perfect diet. It was about understanding the mathematician. I needed bedrock, not a new set of rules, but a new reason for being. And for the first time, with a clarity born of quiet desperation, I understood that this bedrock, if it was to hold, had to be laid deep within the landscape of my own mind. The realization on the edge of my bed was a diagnosis, not a cure. I had correctly identified the illness, a cyclical war waged with the wrong weapons. But I had no prescription for health. The weeks that followed were a strange limbo. The old playbooks, filled with their calendars and calorie counts, now seemed not just ineffective, but insultingly simplistic. I knew another sprint would lead to another collapse. Yet, the inertia of my old narrative was powerful. It was a familiar script, and part of me was still waiting for the cue to start the next punishing act. The true catalyst for change arrived not from within my own reflection, but from an external source of profound empathy. It was during a visit to my father. Now in his early 70s, he has lived a life of quiet, sedentary habits. A dedicated professional, his exercise was largely mental, and his primary hobbies were reading and classic films. Over the past few years, I had watched a gradual but unmistakable narrowing of his world. A knee ache became a reason to avoid walks. Shortness of breath limited gardening. The stairs to his favorite bookstore were now a calculated effort, not an afterthought. One afternoon, he struggled to rise from a deep armchair. It was a simple, mechanical motion that required a rocking momentum and a push off the arms. He laughed it off, a soft, dismissive sound. "Just getting old," he said. But in his eyes, just for a flicker, I saw something else. A flash of frustration, and beneath that, a deep-seated resignation. He was not just feeling old, he was accommodating old, allowing it to dictate the boundaries of his life, shrinking his world to fit his mounting limitations. In that moment, my own future flashed before me with terrifying clarity. I saw not the fear of a certain number on a scale or a clothing size, but the visceral, chilling fear of constrained agency. The weight I carried was no longer an aesthetic concern. It was the tangible, incremental buildup of future limitations. Every extra pound was not a flaw to be hated, but a brick in a wall that would eventually enclose me. My father's struggle was not genetic destiny. It was the cumulative result of 1,000 small choices, a lifetime of signals sent and received between mind and body, culminating in a physical reality that now governed his daily experience. I was watching the logical endpoint of a path I was already well down. This epiphany was the intellectual and emotional pivot. It shifted the entire paradigm. The question was no longer, how do I lose weight? That question had always led me back to tactics, to external rules, to a battle. Instead, a new, more expansive and compelling question formed in my mind. What kind of life do I want to live? This was not a trivial shift. It moved the goal from subtraction to addition. It wasn't about removing pounds. It was about adding life. Did I want a life of vibrant energy or chronic fatigue, of spontaneous adventure or calculated precaution, of feeling strong and capable in my own skin, or feeling like a cautious guest within it? Did I want my body to be a source of limitation or a source of freedom? The answer was a thunderous, unequivocal desire for vitality, for the ability to hike a trail on a whim, to play with future grandchildren without getting winded, to age with grace and strength, not just with surrender. Armed with this new guiding question, my research began anew, but with a different lens. I was no longer scouring the internet for rapid weight loss tricks. I was seeking understanding. I delved into the psychology of habit formation, exploring the work of researchers who spoke of identity-based habits. The premise was revolutionary to me. Lasting change occurs not when you focus on what you want to achieve, but on who you wish to become. You don't run a marathon. You become a runner. The action follows the identity, not the other way around. I studied the physiology of stress, learning how cortisol, the primary stress hormone, can influence fat storage, particularly around the abdomen, and sabotage even the most disciplined eating plans. I understood how poor sleep disrupts the hormones leptin and ghrelin, making you feel hungrier while slowing your metabolism. This wasn't moral failing. It was endocrinology. Food began to shed its moral valence of good and bad. Through this new lens, food became information and fuel. A sugary snack wasn't a cheat. It was a specific set of instructions to my body. A rapid spike in blood sugar, followed by an insulin response and a potential energy crash. A plate of vegetables, lean protein, and whole grains was a different set of instructions. Sustained energy, nutrient satiety, cellular repair. The choice became less about denial and more about selecting the kind of fuel I wanted for the life I desired. Similarly, movement underwent a profound rebranding in my mind. Exercise was no longer punishment for what I had eaten or the shape of my body. It was celebration and capability. It was the joyful expression of a body that could move, strengthen, and endure. A walk wasn't just calorie burn. It was stress relief, a meditation, a way to connect with the outdoors. Strength training wasn't about sculpting for appearance. It was about building functional resilience for life. Lifting groceries, moving furniture, preserving bone density for decades to come. The first practical application of this psychological shift was linguistic, and its power was immediate. I discovered the research on the power of small words. I replaced the phrase, "I can't eat that," with "I don't eat that." The difference is seismic. "I can't" implies an external restriction, a deprivation imposed by a diet or rulebook. It creates a sense of lack and rebellion. It's a child being told no. "I don't," however, is a statement of personal policy, a declaration of identity. It is calm, firm, and internally consistent. It carries the weight of self-definition. "I can't skip my walk" feels like a chore. "I don't miss my morning walk" speaks to the character of a person who prioritizes movement. This simple verbal shift moved the locus of control from outside myself to deep within my own core identity. It was no longer a struggle against temptation. It was an affirmation of who I was choosing to be. I wasn't preparing for a race I could eventually stop running. The old finish line vanished. In its place was a path, a direction. I was slowly, consciously, and with great deliberation, beginning the process of becoming a different type of person. A person whose choices about food, movement, sleep, stress naturally aligned with a deep-seated desire for a long, vibrant, and unlimited life. The goal was no longer to arrive at a destination, but to transform permanently into someone who simply lived differently. The mental shift was the blueprint, a vision of a future self living a life of vitality. But a blueprint is not a house. To move from theory to reality, from aspiration to identity, I needed to begin the daily, deliberate work of construction. This phase was not about monumental overhauls or dramatic declarations. It was about the quiet, repetitive practice of laying bricks, one at a time. It was about building the architecture of my new self through tiny, sustainable actions that served as repeated proofs of concept to my own skeptical mind. I began by formally discarding the concept of grand annual resolutions. They were too brittle, too susceptible to the all-or-nothing thinking that had doomed me before. Instead, I embraced the power of rituals over resolutions. A resolution is a distant goal. A ritual is a present-tense behavior, imbued with personal meaning. My focus narrowed from the abstract, get healthy, to the tangible, immediate present. What could I do today, no matter how small, that was congruent with the person I was becoming? This became my daily guiding principle. The first ritual was disarmingly simple, preparing a nutritious breakfast with intention. This was not about scrambling egg whites in a frenzy before work. It was about the deliberate act of slicing an avocado, toasting a slice of whole grain bread, brewing a cup of green tea. I would do this without my phone, without the morning news. It was 5 minutes of focused attention on fueling my body. This small act was a profound statement. It was a daily vote for my new identity. I am a person who starts their day with care, not chaos, with nourishment, not neglect. These rituals were not weight loss tasks. They were proofs of concept. Each one completed successfully was evidence I could present to myself. See, this is what the person who values vitality does. And you just did it. From this foundation of small rituals, I identified what behavioral scientists call a keystone habit. A single, foundational practice that creates positive ripple effects across multiple areas of life. For me, this became a non-negotiable 20-minute mindful walk, taken first thing in the morning whenever possible. The parameters were specific. No headphones, no podcasts, no destination. Just walking, at a moderate pace, paying attention. I observed the rhythm of my breath, the feeling of my feet meeting the ground, the chill or warmth of the air, the quality of the light. This was not cardio for calorie burn. It was meditation in motion. The effects of this single anchor habit were transformative and multifaceted. It served as a daily dose of natural stress relief, lowering my cortisol levels at the start of the day and setting a calm, centered tone. The exposure to morning light helped regulate my circadian rhythm, improving my sleep quality profoundly. The gentle movement activated my body and mind without the punitive intensity of past workouts, making me feel awake rather than exhausted. Most importantly, it created a psychological victory first thing in the morning. By 7 a.m., I had already kept a commitment to myself. This generated a sense of agency and self-trust that permeated the rest of my day, making subsequent healthy choices feel less like efforts of will and more like natural extensions of the person I had already proven myself to be that morning. This newfound mindfulness naturally flowed into my relationship with food. I began the practice of mindful eating as a dialogue. I committed to eating at least one meal a day without any screens, no phone, no television, no computer. I would sit at a table, arrange my food in a pleasing manner, and simply eat. I paid attention to the colors, textures, and flavors. I chewed slowly, putting my fork down between bites. I listened for the subtle signals of my body. Was I eating from true stomach hunger or from emotional boredom? Was this bite still tasting wonderful, or was I continuing out of habit? When did the first whisper of fullness arise? This practice transformed eating from a mindless, often guilt-laden consumption into a respectful conversation with my own physiology. For the first time, I was listening to my body's language of hunger and satiety, rather than issuing commands based on external rules or suppressing its signals with rigid control. I learned that my body was not an adversary to be managed, but a communicative partner with its own intelligence. A bag of chips eaten mindlessly in front of the television brought no satisfaction. A single, consciously enjoyed piece of dark chocolate could be a deeply fulfilling experience. Inevitably, there were days when the structure wavered. A work crisis would obliterate my evening, leaving me too drained for my planned meal prep. A social event would involve foods that didn't align with my nutritional goals. In the past, these moments were catastrophic. The single broken rule would trigger a cascade of self-recrimination and the "well, I've already ruined it" mentality that led to a full-scale abandonment of the plan. Now, I integrated the most critical component of sustainable change, self-compassion as a safety net. I actively practiced treating myself with the same kindness I would offer a dear friend who had stumbled. A missed walk or an indulgent meal was no longer a failure that defined my character. It was reframed as a data point. The question changed from "why am I so weak?" to "what happened?" I would engage in a gentle, curious inquiry. Was I overly tired? Emotionally stressed? Had I not planned adequately? This neutral, observational stance removed the fuel of shame from the situation. Instead of spiraling, I could learn. The response became, "Okay, that happened. What do I need now to support myself moving forward?" Perhaps it was an early night, a comforting cup of tea, or simply a return to my next regular meal without penance. This approach broke, once and for all, the debilitating cycle of shame, binge, regret that had kept me imprisoned for years. The weight began to fall, steadily and without fanfare. But my primary focus was no longer tethered to the scale's downward trend. My focus had migrated to the quiet, accumulating pride of consistency. It was in the growing sense of latent strength in my limbs as I carried heavy groceries with ease. It was in the mental clarity that replaced the afternoon fog. It was in the deepening sense of trust I was building with myself. The trust that comes from making a promise to yourself, however small, and keeping it day after day. The physical transformation was becoming a visible echo of a far more significant internal reconstruction. As the months passed, a quiet transformation unfolded, one that existed in a parallel universe to the numbers on the scale. The most profound victories were not quantifiable in pounds or inches. They were sensory, emotional, and deeply personal, the unadvertised side effects of a psychological shift, more valuable than any weight loss milestone. These were the rewards that cemented my new identity, making the old life not just undesirable, but unimaginable. The first category was the non-scale victories, NSVs, a term I learned from online communities but whose depth I had never truly felt. They began as subtle whispers and grew into a constant, affirming chorus. I noticed them one crisp autumn morning. I bounded up the 2 flights of stairs to my apartment, carrying groceries, and arrived at my door not breathless, but energized. The dull, persistent ache in my lower back that I had accepted as a fact of existence, a tax for sitting at a desk, simply vanished. My energy, once a precarious resource depleted by mid-afternoon, became a steady, reliable current. The 3 p.m. slump no longer demanded a sugar fix. It was a gentle reminder to stretch or take a brief walk. Sleep, once a fragmented series of wakeful tosses and turns, became a deep, restorative plunge. I would wake before my alarm, not with anxiety, but with a sense of quiet readiness. These were not goals I'd written down. They were gifts, arriving unbidden as I tended to the fundamentals of my well-being. This physical recalibration was accompanied by a profound emotional recalibration. For decades, I had used food as a primary emotional regulator. Boredom was met with snacks. Stress demanded crunchy, salty comforts. Sadness soothed itself with sugar's false promise. Learning to sit with these emotions, to experience their texture without immediately reaching for a culinary anesthetic, was the most challenging and liberating work of the entire journey. I had to develop a new lexicon for my inner state. Through practices like journaling and the mindfulness cultivated on my walks, I began to differentiate between emotional hunger and physical hunger. I learned that anxiety often manifests as a tightness in the chest, not a growl in the stomach. Boredom was a signal for engagement, not ingestion. Food was slowly stripped of its symbolic power and returned to its original simpler role, fuel and occasional pleasure, not a drug. The freedom that came from this disentanglement was staggering. An emotional storm could now pass through me without leaving a trail of empty wrappers and deeper regret in its wake. This shift in internal dialogue inevitably changed my relationship with the mirror. My gaze softened, its focus shifting from judgment to observation, from criticism to curiosity. I no longer scanned for flaws, the softness of my stomach, the roundness of my face. Instead, I began to see function and capability. I would notice the definition in my calves after a long hike and think, look what these legs can carry me through. I observed the set of my shoulders, no longer slumped in defeat, but balanced and open. The lines around my eyes spoke less of fatigue and more of the hours spent squinting in sunlight on walks. The reflection was no longer a static image to be critiqued. It was the evolving home of a person who was becoming more capable by the day. Naturally, this internal evolution began to influence my social dynamics. Navigating gatherings, restaurants, and family meals required a new vocabulary, not of defiance, but of quiet self-assurance. In the past, I would either rigidly abstain, making everyone uncomfortable, or overindulge with secret guilt. Now I operated from a place of centered choice. If offered a food that didn't align with how I wanted to feel, I would say simply and politely, "No, thank you, I'm fine for now." The statement carried no moral weight, no implied judgment of others' choices. It was a neutral fact about my own state. This authenticity, devoid of drama or apology, often sparked curiosity rather than defensiveness. Friends began to ask, not about my diet, but about my energy. The conversation moved from weight loss to well-being, from deprivation to the palpable benefits I was experiencing. I was no longer the person on a diet. I was becoming someone who simply lived by a different, more intentional set of principles. There were also less visible, but equally potent internal shifts. The constant, low-grade background noise of guilt and negotiation surrounding food simply switched off. The mental bandwidth that was once consumed by calorie calculations, planning my next cheat, or berating myself for a slip-up was suddenly freed. This liberated cognitive space felt like opening a window in a stuffy room. That energy was redirected into creativity, into deeper presence in conversations, into reading books that had long gathered dust on my shelf. The discipline of caring for my body proved to be a transferable skill. The self-trust I built by keeping small promises to myself began to spill over into other domains. I became more assertive in my professional life, more present in my relationships, better at setting boundaries. Caring for my physical vessel wasn't a separate project. It was the foundational practice that strengthened my entire psychological architecture. One unremarkable afternoon, as I was effortlessly lifting a suitcase into an overhead bin, a task that would have left me red-faced and straining just a year prior, the realization settled upon me with the weight of absolute truth. The journey I had been on, the one I feared would end, had simply transformed into the fabric of my life itself. The goal was no longer to arrive at some distant finish line of a perfect weight or body. The goal was to enjoy, with deep appreciation and capability, the varied and beautiful terrain of my own ongoing existence. The striving had softened into living. The project was over. The life had begun. Permanence is not a dramatic state. It does not announce itself with fanfare. It is the quiet absence of an old anxiety, the unthinking ease of a once deliberate action, the solid ground beneath your feet that you no longer need to test. The transition from transformation to normal was so gradual I almost missed it. One day, I simply realized that the psychological architecture I had been building was no longer a structure I inhabited. It was the landscape itself. I was living in the new normal, and it was defined not by restriction, but by a profound and effortless liberty. The most telling symbol of this shift was my relationship with the scale. That digital oracle, once the tyrannical arbiter of my daily worth, had been neutered. I no longer approached it with a pounding heart, my mood precariously balanced on its flashing digits. I had unplugged it from my emotional grid. Now, I might step on it once every few weeks or even months out of simple curiosity. The number it displayed was received with the same neutral interest as checking the weather. A data point, nothing more. A slightly higher number might prompt a mindful check-in. Have I been stressed? Sleeping poorly? Eating more processed foods than I realized? But it never triggered panic or self-loathing. It was diagnostic, not definitive. The scale had been demoted from a judge to a tool, and a rarely used one at that. My primary metrics were how my clothes felt, my energy levels throughout the day, the quality of my sleep, and the strength in my body. These were the living, breathing measures of my well-being. This foundational security allowed for true flexibility and sustainability, concepts that were utterly foreign in my previous all-or-nothing paradigm. In the past, a slice of birthday cake at a party was a cheat, a dangerous portal to a week of dietary abandon. Now, it was simply a slice of cake, a delightful part of a celebration. I could enjoy it, truly savor it, without a whisper of guilt because there was no rule being broken. My identity was not someone on a diet. It was someone who generally eats nourishing foods and occasionally enjoys treats. The psychological freedom was exquisite. After the event, I would not launch into a punitive cleanse or extra workout. I would simply return to my regular patterns of eating and movement, not out of a sense of damage control, but because I genuinely preferred how those patterns made me feel, energized, clear-headed, and strong. The balance was dynamic, not rigid. It could bend without breaking because its strength came from a core identity, not a brittle set of external rules. The transformation, I discovered, was not confined to the physical realm. The ripple effect of this psychological shift touched every corner of my life. The self-trust cultivated by keeping promises to my body bled into my career. I began to advocate for myself with a new confidence, setting clearer boundaries and pursuing projects that aligned with my values, not just my fears. In relationships, the practice of self-compassion made me more empathetic and patient with others. The mental clarity and emotional stability became a stable platform from which I could engage with the world more creatively and generously. The discipline of consistent small actions proved that I was capable of change, which made other daunting life challenges seem less insurmountable. Caring for my physical self was not a vanity project isolated from the rest of my existence. It was the foundational practice that strengthened the entire edifice of my life. And so, I arrive at the heart of this story, the core message I wish to extend to you, the listener. Your number might be different. Your triggers, your history, your favorite comforts, they are uniquely yours. But the mechanism of sustainable change is universal. It is not rooted in the latest diet trend or exercise frenzy. It begins with a single, powerful question. Not what do I want to look like, but who do I want to be? Look beyond the surface. Who is that person? Are they energetic, resilient, vibrant, at peace, capable, full of vitality? Define that identity in words that resonate with your soul. Then, begin the quiet work of building that person, one tiny identity-based ritual at a time. Do not start with a marathon. Start with a 5-minute walk as a person who values movement. Do not start with a radical purge of your kitchen. Start by preparing one mindful meal as a person who honors their body. Each action is a vote for your future self. Each consistency is a brick in your new foundation. Your body is not an adversary to be conquered. It is not a problem to be solved. This journey, when approached through the mind first, ceases to be a rebellion against your form. It becomes a homecoming to your potential. It is the process of aligning your daily life with the deepest, most vibrant version of yourself that already exists within you, waiting to be embodied. I lost 50 pounds, but what I found has immeasurably greater mass, a sense of authentic self, an unshakable trust in my own resilience, and the quiet, unwavering knowledge that this is not a phase I am enduring. This is not a temporary costume I'm wearing. This is the conscious, daily choice to live in alignment. This is me. And that deep identity-level congruence is the only thing that can ever be truly permanent. If this story resonated with you, if you felt a flicker of recognition, then you've already taken the first step, the step of curiosity. The psychological shift begins with a single new thought. Here's my invitation to you. 1, pause and ask yourself the question. What kind of life do I truly want to live? What does a vibrant, healthy version of me actually do? Write down 3 words. Is it energetic, strong, at peace? 2, choose one tiny ritual that aligns with that identity, not a grueling hour at the gym. Maybe it's drinking a glass of water first thing in the morning. Maybe it's a 5-minute stretch before bed. Do it as a vote for the person you are becoming. 3, practice the language of identity. Next time you're offered a choice that doesn't align, try saying, I don't, instead of, I can't. Feel the difference in your bones. Your story is not written in the calories you've consumed or the workouts you've skipped. It's written in the thoughts you choose to believe and the tiny actions you repeat every day. If you're ready to explore more stories like this, stories that delve into the heart and mind of change, please subscribe to Health Storytellers and hit the notification bell. We're here to be your companion in rewriting your health narrative, one chapter at a time. In the comments below, I'd love to know, what's one word that describes the identity you want to move toward? Let's support each other. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Remember, the most powerful story you'll ever change is the one you tell yourself. Until next time, be kind to your mind, and the rest will follow.